You are listening to The Tarot Diagnosis. I'm your host, Shannon. I'm a licensed psychotherapist, and I also happen to have a love for tarot. Each episode, I invite you to reflect with me as I work to demystify the tarot and the human experience, all while exploring tarot's connection to mental and emotional health. While this podcast may feel therapeutic, it is not meant to take the place of psychotherapy. So grab your cards and join me as I work to create a pathway to better understand ourselves and those around us. A good question can be life-changing, but we don't tend to talk about questions that way. We tend to only talk about answers that way. Like when we have some sort of breakthrough or epiphany or some level of clarity. We tend to praise this level of insight like we do getting good grades in school. And rarely do we acknowledge, let alone praise, the power of a really, really good question. As a therapist, I often joke that my job is that of a, quote, professional question asker. And it's half joke, half truth. I mean, I, of course, don't diagnose people with questions or cure them with clever phrasing, but the truth is the arc of a therapy session, and really sometimes the arc of an entire therapeutic relationship can hinge on just one single, well-timed, well-crafted question. And it's not just what I ask, but also when I ask it, how I ask it, what I don't say before or after I ask a question, how much silence is used, and what I have experienced both in therapy and in my tarot practice is a well-crafted question can either crack a door wide open or slam it shut, deadbolt it, toss the key, and cause someone to be completely shut off, shut down, not present, not willing to engage. And, a good question obviously invites openness and curiosity. I mean, sometimes a good question can also lead to some level of resistance, but also not so good questions can trigger intense defensiveness. I think questions can also feel like really tender offerings, which are really nice. Think about maybe how we engage with our tarot cards. And sometimes questions can feel like accusations. And we all know what that is like. I think we have all been both on the receiving end of that and on the giving end of that, where, maybe we think we're, being clever and how we're dressing up a question to be perceived as concern. Really, we're just accusing someone of something. When you go through training to be a therapist, you spend all this time learning theory, different modalities, interventions, frameworks. We learn how to listen really well, how to reflect, how to hold silence without freaking out, because silence is so uncomfortable for so many people. But I think the real art of therapy and the aspect of being a therapist that really only sharpens with time and experience and epic failures is learning how to ask a really good question. I've seen people's bodies change drastically in response to questions. I've seen them just become completely open and vulnerable and loose, as if the weight of the world has just been released from their shoulders. I've seen them tense up and want to leave and not finish a session. Just shut down completely, retreat, or over-intellectualize instead of stay in their body. And that's usually for several different reasons. Like maybe I asked a certain question too soon, or I asked it too bluntly, or that question was way too close to something that was still too raw and not ready to be tended to. And I think it's important to remember that I don't think any question's neutral. There's always something behind a question. And questions themselves can actually be interventions, whether we are intending them to be an intervention or not. And honestly, that's what I find so fascinating, or maybe not fascinating, but maybe what struck me as odd about how casual we can be when we are crafting questions for the tarot. Because we know that tarot is inherently therapeutic. It deals in story and projection and pattern and meaning making. And all of that is what helps create the material of the psyche. And yet, so much of the emphasis in tarot or the education surrounding tarot is really just placed on mastering the cards, memorizing meanings, studying spreads, reading all the books, taking classes, really focusing on perfecting that tarot language. And I mean, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I love all that. I do all of those things all the time. I help create all of those things all of the time. But when we're only focused on becoming fluent in the language of tarot, we're also limiting ourselves, limiting our interactions with the cards, limiting our readings for others, and just like limiting the overall depth and potential that we have to access greater material if we also focused on learning how to craft a really good question. I think many of you can relate to this, that you can feel incredibly well-versed in all 78 cards. And whether you're giving a reading to yourself or you're receiving a reading from somebody else, you can still walk away from a reading feeling unchanged, disappointed, unchallenged, or bored. And that can often be because the question lacked depth and meaning. I mean, we can all shuffle beautifully. We can pull with intention. We can have the tarot ritual. We can have what we think is an epic interpretation filled with nuance and depth, and it be essentially meaningless if the question we asked is related to us circling the same insights or thought or idea that we've had 100 times before, because the questions that we're asking are often designed to just keep us exactly where we are. Something that I've realized as a therapist is, and this is something that I think is easy to forget, a lot of insight and answers actually rest within the questions themselves that we're asking. I mean, think about the questions we ask our cards. If you are someone who does readings for other people, think about the questions that those people bring to you. Usually there's an answer in that question. And what we do with that information can either strengthen a reading or weaken it. So I think it's important to remember that the questions that we come up with or the questions that people bring to us are really that first step into either our own or someone else's unconscious material. I feel like I've seen readings that were technically really impressive and really sound wonderful interpretations, and maybe even helped me see the cards in a new way, but still maybe lacked the outcome that the recipient wanted. And that's usually because the question was lacking. So one of my favorite meetups in the tarot diagnosis membership community, the symposium, is the reading room. I mean, all the meetups are my favorite, but in different ways. But the reading room is so fun and intimate and interesting. And this might surprise people, but my favorite part of that meetup isn't the actual readings necessarily, but it's watching people craft the question. And gosh, I feel like I can feel my resistance even sharing this because I'm like, oh, folks who are in the community and listening to this right now, I don't want you all to think I'm like watching you so intently. Now you're nervous when you're giving readings to folks. But I do love watching you all come up with questions. It's so fun. Like, you can see their minds working in real time. Sometimes they look really intently at the person that they're reading for. And sometimes their gaze drifts off, maybe like towards the corner of the room. And, there might be like a noticeable shift as they're shuffling. They might do a meditative pause. They might just sit with what someone shared with them and they're realizing now, oh, shit, it's up to me to like formulate some sort of meaningful question and interpretation. And what's interesting, and I don't know if the group has ever consciously noticed this, is that every reading in the reading room already begins with a question, really before anyone who's giving the reading actually starts even shuffling the cards. And I feel like I probably got ahead of myself here. So for those of you who are not a part of this membership community, let me back up a little bit and tell you what's happening here in this moment so you have a little bit of context. So each month there's a small group of us that gather and I write everyone's name on a little slip of paper and put it in a little box. And I randomly pull 2 names at a time to create a reading pair. And so one person goes first by asking a question, usually something super broad, like, I'm feeling stuck in this certain area of my life. What should I do? And because the members of this community obviously are aligned with the more kind of psychodynamic therapy-informed approach to tarot, they rarely read directly from that initial question that is offered. Instead, they always pause and they sit with it. They look all around it. They like kind of look beneath it. They try to like kind of reshape it into something a little bit more precise or therapeutic. And I can always tell when they've landed somewhere important, often even before they pull a card for their reading partner, because the person receiving the reading will typically respond in a certain way. So when a new question has been formulated or asked by the reader, the recipient might say something like, or respond with, huh, that kind of just like, huh, oh, interesting. Or yeah, that's a good question, call it out. And I think that moment is the best part for me sometimes because I can see that something has already happened within the reading pair before a card has even been pulled. And, sometimes it can be difficult. We often spend a couple minutes formulating questions before the reading starts. And, I occasionally feel this urge to swoop in because, I've been doing this so long as a therapist. I love asking questions. So usually something clicks for me right away and I have to stop myself. And it's so similar to the restraint, and other therapists will absolutely relate to this. But it's so similar to the restraint that I have to practice in the therapy room, to not rush insight, and let the client come to a certain understanding on their own. And, it's funny because like when you've worked with someone long enough, you learn each other's rhythms, your body language, kind of just silent cues. And clients will often recognize when I've had some sort of insight, but haven't shared it yet. And so they'll say something to me like, I can tell you're thinking something. Tell me what it is. And I usually laugh and I'm just like, yeah, I am thinking something. Yeah, you caught that. But what I'm experiencing or noticing right now is probably far less potent than what you're discovering yourself. So tell me what you found first, then we can compare notes, is usually I say something along those lines. But, kind of back to crafting a good question, especially when it comes to tarot, I think it's includes 2 equal parts, skill, obviously, and impeccable observation. And, think about how important observation is just just being a human in this world. But also, the best writers that we know are prolific observers. They write what they see, feel, taste, touch, experience, know, don't know. And I think all of those are key ingredients in crafting our own prolific questions. So what if you don't feel particularly skilled in the question asking department? Well, there's tarot for that, and that's why we're here. And what's kind of ironic about all of this is I actually don't really ask tarot questions very often in my personal practice, because for me, my personal tarot practice is more about allowing the cards to ask me the questions. And so if you've followed my work for any length of time, you know that my relationship to tarot is rooted in therapy, psychoanalysis, introspection, curiosity, all the things that supposedly lead to self-actualization and individuation. So, of course, I'm naturally less interested in, what's going to happen next than I am at, trying to derive insight or meaning from the cards. I'm less concerned with prediction and more interested in kind of noticing unhelpful patterns and narratives, and, way less focused on searching for certainty than I am just growth and understanding and expanding my brain. So when I sit with the cards, I'm not looking for them to confirm, certain ideas or maybe even soothe me necessarily, but I am inviting them to ask me something and maybe to reflect something back that I maybe have been avoiding, or to disrupt my own narratives long enough so that I'm forced to answer a question that I maybe didn't think of or that feels uncomfortable to me. And another aspect of asking a good question, I think, is having to admit some level of uncertainty and to kind of loosen our grip on certainty just long enough for nuance to emerge. And I think a good question allows for that. I think it introduces a level of movement and in motion in aspects of our life where maybe we've become a bit stagnant, or honestly, even too outcome oriented and not process oriented enough. And honestly, most importantly, I think a good question returns agency to the person asking it. And this is really why I don't read the cards from a predictive lens. And I mean, if that's something that you enjoy and that's your thing, like, please keep doing that. I love all of my fellow tarot readers who are diviners and read predictively. I do find it so fascinating. That's just not my thing. But, when we read predictively or don't ask the right questions, we are sometimes unknowingly outsourcing our own agency, our own authority, our own autonomy. When we ask things like, is this going to work out? What should I do? Is this the right person for me? And, those types of questions aren't, inherently bad, but they do give a lot of power to the cards, and they put a lot of control into the hands of some sort of imagined authority that we think knows better than we do. And those types of questions can really keep us in a role of passivity instead of activity. And I think that's counterintuitive to the therapeutic experience. I mean, for example, if you've ever sat across from a good therapist, I'm going to emphasize good therapist, chances are you've probably heard them say something along the lines of, you're the expert on yourself. And oh God, I mean, if if for some reason your therapist is telling you that they're the expert on you, please, holy shit, run away, find a new therapist. Red flag. Um, but we need to remember that when we are reading tarot too. Like, even though these cards open our minds and help us access unconscious material and different levels of the psyche, we are still the experts on ourselves. Okay, back to question asking though. I feel like I got a little sidetracked there. I know when I've asked a good question or when someone has asked me a good question. This is more so like, I think when someone's asked me a good question, because it lingers, I will think about it for days, for weeks or months. Good questions follow you out of therapy sessions, follow you out of tarot readings or hangouts with friends, and they really embed themselves into your body. They find their way into your relationships. They they just stick around. I mean, sometimes questions don't even necessarily, really good questions don't even demand an immediate answer. And I think maybe that's part of the power of a good question too. Sometimes questions can take years for us to answer fully or accurately, but the fact that the question has stayed with us, has kept us company all that time, really says something. And thinking about how certain questions can stick with us reminds me about how, even asking questions aren't necessarily about getting the right answer, but more about creating the conditions for insight. So, how the hell do we do this? How do we get better at asking questions? Well, we can practice with tarot, of course. So, at the most basic level, when we're crafting a question, a good tarot question has to be open-ended. And well, I shouldn't say has to, but I feel like, in my opinion, a good tarot question starts by being open-ended. Because when we're asking yes or no questions, it really just shows there's a desire for certainty, a quick fix, an instant sense of relief, some sort of reduction in anxiety, because, if we ask a yes or no question and get an answer, then maybe suddenly we don't feel so much pressure because the cards have told us what to do, what to think, what to say, what to believe. And these types of kind of like yes, no, closed type questions really shut down curiosity. And then there's no room for nuance. And they take away our own agency and responsibility. So, an example of some open-ended questions you might ask is always start with what, how, when, why. So things like, what is being asked of me right now? Or what am I not seeing about this dynamic? Or what sort of internal conflict is being activated right now? In the psychotherapy world, there's this concept called Socratic questioning, and it involves carefully sequenced questions to help clarify meaning, evoke, emotional insight and responses. And they're never about interrogation. It's a very collaborative experience. And, when we're using tarot well, it operates in a very similar way, because rather than asking the cards to tell us what to do, we often use them to think alongside us. They're our trusted collaborators. So a Socratic tarot question might sound like, what feels most threatening here and why? Or what might be another way of understanding what's happening right now? Another kind of formula for crafting a good question is the vertical arrow questioning. And it's used in therapy and in tarot. We just might not be aware of it. And it involves kind of repeatedly asking what a thought means in different ways. So it might sound something like, okay, it's like, say you were exploring some sort of cognitive distortion. We might ask something like, if that were true, what would that mean about you? And then ask, what would be so bad about that? So you can see kind of like that down arrow level of questioning. In tarot, that level of, or that structure, I should say, of questioning can really deepen a reading, because it helps us go just beyond that initial surface level question, like, why am I anxious? Instead, using that vertical technique, we might say something or ask something like, okay, if the worst thing happened here, what would that say about you? Or what aspect of your identity or values system feels at risk? And then, well, what belief is being protected by this fear or anxiety? We can take a look at another variation of the structure and kind of shift it from content to process by, instead of asking, okay, well, what am I afraid of or what am I anxious about, saying something or asking something like, what feels dangerous about having this thought? And tarot's really uniquely positioned for this kind of questioning because it helps us externalize all of this internal material. A card goes beyond just symbolizing fear. When we pull it, for example, or anxiety, it gives a narrative to it. It gives a scene. It gives posture. There's this whole image and story playing out in front of us. And the reason I love this so much as a therapeutic tool and the whole foundation of why this is so therapeutic is because tarot allows us to examine all of these beliefs without becoming, fused with or consumed by them. Okay, so I feel like I have just talked so much about, I rambled about why a good question is so important. But I really want to practice this. I want you all to grab a deck if you can, because the best way to use the cards for learning how to ask better questions is really by pulling a card and just seeing what questions come up for you naturally. And then, that can be our starting point, and we can edit and modify the question to give it more depth and body. And I know I mentioned this earlier, but I'll say it again. You're getting a glimpse into how I read tarot naturally for myself 90% of the time, because it's rare that I ask a question and pull a card. I often pull a card and have the card ask me the question. So let's do that now. So I'm using Earth Magic Tarot, which I have been obsessed with lately. So we're just going to shuffle and pull a card and see what question comes up. And I would love for you to do this alongside me. And then also, if you want to just give me your insight onto what I pull, I love hearing that too. Okay, so 9 of Swords. This is actually a really easy starting point. I feel like I was already talking about this card a few minutes ago. I'm talking about fear and anxiety. And of course, the 9 of Swords shows up. Okay, so the 9 of Swords, the first question, and I'm not going to judge myself. I'm just going to quickly think of a question. First question that comes to mind is, what thoughts are plaguing me? What thoughts are causing me anxiety? So really standard question for this card, right? We typically associate this card to be the anxiety card, the ruminating card. And yeah, completely normal starting point. It's an open-ended question, which is good. It also kind of, accurately names distress, but it's still kind of a surface level question. So, the 9 of Swords isn't just about what we're thinking or ruminating on. And it's also about what those thoughts do to us. It's also about where we take them, where they originated, how they fester. And so in order to ask a deeper, better question, we also have to be able to get deeper with the card meaning itself. So having just, shared those deeper layers of the 9 of Swords, our initial question of, what thoughts are plaguing me, what's causing me anxiety, might then shift something like, what am I assuming these thoughts say about me or my future? What meaning am I assigning to these thoughts? What story am I telling myself when I can't sleep? What feels most threatening about my current situation? And why does my mind keep returning to it? If this thought were true, what would it say about me? How am I responding to these thoughts? And in what ways are those responses helping me? And in what ways are they hurting me? What does this card suggest about my relationship to fear and worry? If the worst case scenario happened, what would that say about who I am? What's the most realistic outcome here? Okay, so I just named a whole bunch of questions. I need to go back and count how many I just shared, but that felt like a lot. So hopefully you're getting the gist of how we explored a deeper meaning of the card and then took that initial question and gave it more depth and meaning. So let's go ahead and try. We'll do another one. Try again. I'm hoping we get a lighter card so I can show how this works with a non kind of heavy, anxious card. Perfect. Thank you. I ask and you shall receive, right? Three of Cups. Okay. So this is a good one. So immediately I see this card and I think, where do I feel most supported by others? Not a bad question, open-ended, likely to get some insight, but we can absolutely take this question further. But in order to do that, again, we have to know that the Three of Cups isn't just about support or friendship or celebration. That's just kind of that surface level meaning. It's also, again, about how we experience connection and what we believe to be true about our ability or inability to connect or to give or receive support and just engage in moments of joy. Okay, so with that in mind, we might take that initial question of, where or when do I feel most supported by others and ask, what feels nourishing to me about connection? What feels complicated about connecting with others? What sort of personal beliefs or stories shape how I engage in connection with others? If I were excluded from a group, what would that say about me? When I have been excluded from a group, what do I believe that has said about me? What feels risky when I allow myself to lean on others? What parts of my identity thrive when I'm in celebration or when I'm in community with others? What role do I tend to take on when I'm in group settings? What versions of myself emerge in different group settings? What feels vulnerable when I acknowledge that I need other people? That's a personal one. What belief do I hold about my relationship to independence and interdependence? What do I believe to be true about reciprocity and emotional exposure in group settings? I feel like this one's I could just keep going. So I'll stop there. But something came up while I was sharing those questions a second ago. You might have caught it when I said, "Oh, that one's personal." I'm curious if any of you noticed that I paused with a certain question when my brain was kind of circling it because I realized it was coming from my own stuff. And I think it's important to also focus on the fact, and I didn't touch on this at all earlier, and I should have, but it's coming up for me now. And that's the fact that we know tarot is an inherently projective tool. We are projecting ourselves onto it, even if we are not reading for ourselves, even if someone else is in front of us. The way that we engage with the cards, the way that we ask questions, how we ask questions, our level of depth that we're willing to go to, our fears about asking certain questions, our comfort levels, all of those play into how we formulate questions. And then, of course, the experience the person in front of us or ourselves is going to have. So yeah, important to keep in mind. Okay, so this episode ended up being way longer than they normally are and way longer than I anticipated. So if you have listened this long for all 30 plus minutes, I don't know how long it will exactly be when it's been edited, but probably 30 something minutes. Thank you so much for hanging out here for this long. And yeah, I'll just wrap up by saying I think it's really important to remember that when we ask, or are at least willing to ask deeper questions, those open, reflective, really brave questions that go beyond the surface level meaning of a card, we allow tarot to show up for us in even more powerful ways than it already does. Thank you so much for listening to the Tarot Diagnosis. For more tarot and mental health content, follow the Tarot Diagnosis on Instagram. You can also subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and sign up to receive the Tarot Diagnosis emails, where you'll have access to exclusive spreads and exciting announcements. To join an incredible community of tarot and psychology enthusiasts, join the Tarot Diagnosis membership community, The Symposium, by visiting thetarotdiagnosis.com.